Staff Sergeant Michael Mick Harrison had been expecting standard military accommodations when he arrived at Remote Station Alpha 7, not what appeared to be the most unusual welcome gift in the history of interstellar frontier assignments. The facility perched on the edge of contested space like a diplomatic lighthouse, serving as neutral ground for peace negotiations between human colonial forces and Velkari territorial defenders, whose conflicts had been escalating toward full-scale war, despite both species' apparent preference for finding alternatives to mutual annihilation. Sergeant Harrison, Base Commander Colonel Peterson, greeted him in the main briefing room, her expression carrying the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she was about to deliver information that would fundamentally challenge his understanding of routine military service. "Welcome to Alpha 7. I trust your journey from Earth Central Command was uneventful." "Yes, ma'am. Ready for assignment to security duties and whatever frontier hospitality involves at joint human-alien facilities." "About that," Colonel Peterson said, activating displays that showed the station's strategic position in the contested border zone. "Your assignment involves responsibilities that extend beyond standard security protocols. We have a unique situation that requires someone with your psychological profile and military experience." Mick examined the tactical displays, noting that Alpha 7's isolation made it both strategically vital for maintaining communication between species and vulnerably exposed to the kind of sabotage that had been destroying other diplomatic facilities throughout the frontier zone. "What kind of unique situation?" Before Colonel Peterson could answer, the briefing room doors opened to admit what appeared to be the answer to his question. Two 6-year-old Velkari girls whose pointed ears and bioluminescent markings identified them as alien, but whose composed bearing and intelligent eyes suggested they were considerably more than simple refugee children requiring humanitarian assistance. "Sergeant Harrison," Colonel Peterson said with the careful tone of someone delivering news that would either make perfect sense or create the most expensive diplomatic incident of his career, "meet Lyra and Myra Velthane. They've been entrusted to your care under ancient protocols that we're still learning to understand." Mick stared at the twins, then at Colonel Peterson, then back at the children whose focused attention suggested they were evaluating him according to criteria he couldn't begin to guess. "Ma'am, I think there's been some sort of administrative error. I'm assigned to security duties, not childcare duties, involving alien minors at a military facility." "There's no error," Colonel Peterson replied, though her expression suggested she understood his confusion. "Lyra and Myra require a guardian whose character and competence meet specific requirements that their culture uses to evaluate trustworthiness and protection capability." "And you believe I meet those requirements based on psychological evaluations, military service records, and responses to crisis situations that indicate someone capable of prioritizing protection over personal convenience or political advantage." The colonel activated personnel files that showed assessments Mick didn't remember taking, also based on the twins' own evaluation, which they've been conducting since your arrival. Mick looked at Lyra and Myra, noting that they'd been watching his reactions with the kind of careful attention that suggested his responses to unexpected information were being analyzed for characteristics he wasn't aware of displaying. "You've been evaluating me," he said to the twins, who responded with solemn nods that indicated the evaluation process was both serious and ongoing. "Your heart sounds steady when surprised," Lyra said in carefully pronounced standard Galactic, her voice carrying the musical accent that marked Velkari speech. "Not angry or frightened, just curious. And you ask questions about understanding rather than control," Myra added, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with colors that mixed cultural briefings had identified as indicating approval or contentment. "Papa said to look for that in potential guardians." "Papa, our father was the previous bond warden," Lyra explained with the matter-of-fact tone that children used when discussing concepts adults found complex. He protected the hidden vault until the bad people made him have an accident. Colonel Peterson's expression grew grim at the twins' casual reference to their father's death. General Velthing was eliminated 6 months ago during what appeared to be equipment failure, but was actually assassination designed to leave the defensive vault inaccessible. Defensive vault. That ancient Velkari technology that's been secretly protecting this station and several frontier settlements from sabotage attempts, infiltration by corporate agents, and systematic attacks designed to eliminate diplomatic facilities. Colonel Peterson activated classified displays that showed defensive systems Mick hadn't known existed. The twins are the genetic keys needed to activate technology that operates through consciousness integration, requiring both their biosignatures and a human guardian whose psychological profile demonstrates trustworthiness. Mick felt his comfortable understanding of routine security assignment crumbling as he realized that his frontier duty involved considerably more than perimeter defense and equipment maintenance. So by accepting responsibility for their care I become, what exactly? Bond Warden, Myra said helpfully. Guardian of the defensive systems that keep the peace talks from being destroyed by people who prefer profitable wars to successful negotiations. It's a big responsibility, Lyra added with a kind of solemn consideration that suggested she understood the implications better than most adults. But Papa said humans could be good bond wardens if they cared more about protecting people than controlling technology. Mick looked around the briefing room, noting that other personnel were watching his interaction with the twins with expressions that suggested his decision would affect more than just childcare arrangements. And if I decline this guardianship, then the defensive vault remains inaccessible. The station becomes vulnerable to the same corporate sabotage that destroyed other diplomatic facilities, and the peace negotiations fail while corporate interests profit from resumed military contracts, Colonel Peterson said with brutal honesty. Also, Lyra and Myra remain without protection from the same interests that eliminated their father to gain control of defensive technology. Mick examined the tactical displays showing hidden defensive systems that had been protecting the station, then looked at the 2 alien children, whose obvious intelligence was matched by their need for someone willing to accept responsibility for both their welfare and the security of everyone who depended on the diplomatic success that corporate interests were systematically trying to prevent. Myra, he said, crouching to their eye level while noting that their bioluminescent markings were shifting to colors that indicated hope mixed with careful evaluation. Your father was protecting important defensive systems that keep people safe during peace negotiations. He was protecting everyone from the bad people who want the talks to fail so they can sell more weapons and steal more planets. Lyra confirmed with the directness that children brought to complex political situations. And you need a new guardian who can help you keep those protections working. We need someone who will care about protecting people more than controlling powerful technology, Myra said, her violet eyes meeting his with the kind of assessment that suggested his answer would determine whether she trusted him with responsibilities that affected thousands of lives. Mick felt the weight of unexpected responsibility settling around him like an elaborate piece of equipment he'd be learning to operate under the most stressful conditions imaginable. But the twins' obvious need for protection and the station's vulnerability to corporate sabotage made his decision relatively straightforward. Well, he said, standing while noting that both children were watching him with expressions that mixed hope with continued evaluation. I've always been terrible at declining assignments that involve protecting people who can't protect themselves. Looks like I'm about to learn what bond warden duties involve. As alarms began sounding throughout the station, indicating that corporate agents had been monitoring his decision and were already moving to prevent the defensive vault activation. Mick realized that his simple frontier security assignment had just evolved into protecting two remarkable children and their people's defensive legacy, from interests that preferred diplomatic facilities to remain vulnerable to the kind of profitable conflicts that generated military contracts rather than successful peace negotiations. The hidden vault existed beneath Remote Station Alpha 7 like a technological cathedral that had been waiting centuries for the right combination of genetic codes and human psychology to unlock its secrets. Lyra and Myra led Mick through access tunnels that hadn't appeared on any schematic he'd studied, past defensive systems that had been secretly protecting the station, while remaining invisible to both human sensors and corporate surveillance networks. "The Bond Warden right," Lyra explained as they descended toward the vault's entrance, "creates partnership between human psychology and Velkari technology that prevents misuse of defensive systems." "Papa said humans think differently about protection than most species," Myra added, her small hand finding Mick's with the kind of trust that suggested she'd already decided he was worthy of the responsibility they were offering. "You protect because you care, not because you want to control." The vault's entrance required both twins to place their hands on bioscanners, while Mick spoke formal acceptance words that created legal and technological bonds, spanning both species' authority structures. The moment the protocols activated, Mick felt his consciousness expand to include awareness of defensive networks that stretched across multiple star systems, protecting not just Alpha 7, but dozens of frontier settlements from the corporate-sponsored attacks that had been systematically eliminating diplomatic facilities. "The defensive systems are extraordinary," he said, accessing monitoring networks that showed real-time protection of settlements throughout the contested zone. "These aren't just local facility defenses. They're comprehensive early warning and response networks that can coordinate protection across entire sectors." "Our ancestors understood that peace requires active protection from those who profit from war," Lyra said, with the kind of wisdom that suggested Velkari children learned about defensive philosophy along with basic language skills. "The Bond Warden partnership ensures that powerful technology serves protection rather than conquest." The vault's central chamber contained crystalline interfaces that responded to both the twins' biosignatures and Mick's psychological patterns, creating a hybrid control system that required cooperation between human strategic thinking and Velkari defensive technology. The displays showed not just current defensive status, but historical records of attacks that had been thwarted, infiltration attempts that had been detected, and sabotage operations that had been prevented through automated systems that corporate interests didn't know existed. The recent equipment failures at the station, Mick realized, reviewing defensive logs that showed a pattern of corporate sabotage attempts. They weren't random mechanical problems. They were systematic infiltration attempts that were blocked by hidden defensive protocols. "Bad people have been trying to break the defensive system so they can destroy the peace talks," Myra confirmed, accessing displays that showed corporate agents throughout the frontier zone. "But the defenses work best when they have a Bond Warden who understands that protecting people is more important than protecting secrets." Mick examined the evidence of systematic corporate conspiracy, noting that the attacks on diplomatic facilities hadn't been random terrorism, but coordinated campaigns designed to ensure peace negotiations failed, while maintaining plausible deniability about corporate involvement in preventing diplomatic solutions. "How many other Bond Wardens are currently active?" "None," Lyra said quietly, her bioluminescent markings shifting to colors that indicated sadness mixed with determination. "Papa was the last one before the bad people made him have his accident. The other Guardians were eliminated through equipment failures, atmospheric problems, and accidents that weren't really accidents. Which is why the corporate interests have been able to destroy other diplomatic facilities while this station remained protected." Mick understood, feeling the weight of responsibility settling around him, as he realized he was now the only person with access to defensive technology that could prevent the systematic elimination of peace negotiation efforts. And why my acceptance of the Bond Warden role is so strategically significant. The Bond Warden partnership grants authority over defensive networks, but also responsibility for ensuring they serve protection rather than exploitation. Myra explained, activating displays that showed the scope of his newfound authority. The technology responds to intention and character, rather than just clearance levels or political authorization. Mick felt their shared consciousness beginning to integrate as the bond deepened, revealing not just technical capabilities, but the emotional resonance that made Valkyrie defensive technology so effective. The systems didn't just detect threats, they detected the intentions and psychological patterns that indicated whether someone sought to protect or exploit vulnerable populations. The corporate agents infiltrating the station, he said, accessing threat assessment displays that revealed the scope of the conspiracy. They're not just trying to sabotage peace negotiations. They're trying to gain control of defensive technology that could be used for conquest rather than protection. Which is why the Bond Warden right requires partnership with humans whose psychology prioritizes protection over control, Lyra said, her consciousness touching his through the technological interface. Your species understands that the most powerful defensive capabilities should serve the vulnerable rather than the ambitious. As alarms continued sounding throughout the station, indicating that corporate infiltrators were moving to prevent the defensive activation and eliminate inconvenient Bond Wardens before they could expose the conspiracy. Mick realized that his acceptance of responsibility for two alien children had evolved into protecting the future of diplomatic cooperation from interests that viewed peace as an obstacle to profitable warfare. Myra, he said, feeling their trust and his own protective instincts settling into the kind of partnership that made advanced defensive technology possible. Your father protected these systems until corporate interests eliminated him. Papa said the most important protection was making sure the right person could continue the work if something happened to him. Myra replied with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children showed toward concepts adults found tragic. He said humans could be good Bond Wardens because you understand that protecting people requires being willing to accept responsibility even when it's dangerous. And now we're your responsibility, Lyra added with a smile that suggested she found the situation more hopeful than concerning. But you're also our partner in protecting everyone else from the bad people who prefer profitable wars to successful peace. Mick looked at the defensive displays showing real-time protection of settlements throughout the frontier zone, then at the two remarkable children whose trust had made him responsible for technology that could either save or doom diplomatic efforts throughout contested space. Well, he said, activating the formal Bond Warden protocols that would make their partnership official while simultaneously making all of them permanent targets for corporate elimination. I've always believed that the most important military work involves protecting people who can't protect themselves. Looks like I'm about to learn whether that philosophy scales up to protecting entire civilizations from corporate war profiteering. As they prepared to formalize the Bond Warden partnership that would grant them joint authority to expose the conspiracy, while making them permanent targets for interests that preferred diplomatic facilities to remain vulnerable to profitable sabotage. Mick realized that his routine frontier assignment had evolved into accepting responsibility for the survival of peace negotiations that corporate interests had been systematically destroying throughout the contested zone. The Bond Warden activation triggered immediate responses from monitoring systems throughout both the station and the broader frontier command structure. As rival officers and corporate agents scrambled to control or eliminate Mick's newfound authority over defensive systems that could determine the outcome of territorial negotiations, and the survival of diplomatic efforts throughout the contested zone. Within hours of the bonding, Mick found himself at the center of political maneuvering that made routine security. The bond warden's status cannot be legitimate, Major Hendricks announced during the emergency command briefing, his tone carrying barely controlled anger about what he viewed as unauthorized assumption of alien authority. Sergeant Harrison lacks the security clearance, cultural training, and command authority necessary to control defensive systems that affect multiple star systems. The bond warden, right, Colonel Peterson replied with patient professionalism, operates under Velkari cultural law that predates human involvement in this sector. The twins' genetic codes combined with Sergeant Harrison's psychological profile created legitimate authority that our command structure is required to recognize under interspecies cooperation protocols. Mick listened to the debate while reviewing intelligence data that his enhanced access was now providing, using the bond connection to trace systematic infiltration that extended far beyond simple sabotage attempts. The corporate conspiracy was more sophisticated than station security had realized, involving coordinated elimination of defensive personnel and systematic corruption of command structures that left diplomatic facilities vulnerable to attacks that appeared to be terrorist actions rather than corporate profit protection operations. The defensive systems aren't just protecting this station, he reported to Colonel Peterson during a brief recess in the command proceedings. The bond access is revealing that corporate agents have been systematically infiltrating frontier facilities to disable protective networks that have been preventing attacks on diplomatic personnel and peace negotiation efforts. What kind of infiltration? Personnel placement in key security positions, modification of equipment to create vulnerabilities that can be exploited during coordinated attacks, and systematic elimination of individuals whose knowledge or authority might interfere with corporate control over frontier defensive capabilities. Mick showed her evidence that painted a disturbing picture of manipulation spanning the entire frontier zone. The bond warden authority provides access to intelligence networks that reveal the scope of corporate coordination in preventing successful peace negotiations. And the twins' role in this conspiracy. Lyra and Myra aren't just genetic keys to defensive technology. They're the last surviving members of the Velkari bloodline that can activate ancient defensive systems designed to protect against exactly the kind of systematic attack that corporate interests have been conducting. Mick felt their shared consciousness revealing information that normal intelligence gathering couldn't access. Their father and other bond wardens were eliminated specifically to prevent access to defensive capabilities that could expose and counter corporate sabotage. Colonel Peterson's expression grew grim as she processed the implications. So by accepting guardianship, you've become the only person with authority to activate defensive systems that could protect diplomatic efforts throughout the frontier zone. And the only person with access to intelligence networks that can expose the systematic nature of corporate conspiracy to prevent peace negotiations through elimination of protective capabilities and defensive personnel. Mick accessed tactical analysis that revealed the scope of planned attacks. The corporate strategy involves coordinated assault on remaining diplomatic facilities while eliminating bond wardens who might activate defensive systems that could prevent the attacks or expose their corporate sponsorship. The bond connection was also revealing that several station personnel had been compromised by corporate interests, creating security vulnerabilities that would be exploited during the planned assault on Alpha 7. The defensive systems had been detecting infiltration attempts for months, but without a bond warden to authorize active countermeasures, the station had been gradually becoming more vulnerable to the kind of coordinated attack that had destroyed other diplomatic facilities. The equipment failures and communication breakdowns, Mick realized, accessing defensive logs that showed patterns of systematic sabotage. They've been probing attacks designed to identify vulnerabilities that can be exploited during a larger assault. And my assignment to this facility was specifically requested by corporate agents who wanted to ensure that any potential bond warden would be someone whose military record suggested compliance with authority, rather than independent decision-making that might interfere with corporate objectives. Mick felt the pieces clicking together as he understood how thoroughly the conspiracy had attempted to control personnel assignments. They didn't expect me to accept guardianship of the twins or activate defensive systems that could expose their infiltration. The intelligence they were gathering through the bond also revealed that Velkari Minister Corvith had been coordinating with human corporate interests to ensure that traditional Velkari reluctance to trust human guardians would prevent bond warden activation and leave defensive systems inaccessible during the planned attacks. The false flag operation, Mick said, accessing strategic intelligence through his enhanced authority, is designed to eliminate this station while making it appear to be the result of extremist attacks rather than corporate sabotage of diplomatic facilities. Corporate operatives will conduct the assault, while evidence is planted to suggest that Velkari extremists attacked their own people to prevent peace negotiations with human colonial forces, Colonel Peterson confirmed, her expression showing that station intelligence had been tracking similar patterns at other facilities. The attack serves dual purposes, eliminating defensive capabilities and creating justification for military, rather than diplomatic solutions to territorial disputes. Mick looked around the command facility, noting that the bond connection was revealing which personnel had been compromised by corporate interests and which could be trusted during the coming assault. The choice between maintaining bond warden status and relinquishing it isn't just about personal responsibility for two children, he said, understanding the true stakes for the first time. It's about whether diplomatic efforts throughout the frontier zone have any chance of surviving systematic corporate sabotage, designed to ensure profitable conflicts rather than successful peace negotiations. The formal bond warden ceremony grants you permanent authority to coordinate defensive operations while providing protection against elimination attempts that target guardians who might expose corporate conspiracy, Colonel Peterson said, her expression showing that she understood the implications. But the ceremony also makes you, the twins, and anyone supporting the defensive activation permanent targets for interests that prefer diplomatic facilities to remain vulnerable to profitable attacks. Mick examined the evidence of systematic conspiracy, then looked toward the secured area where Lyra and Myra were waiting for his decision about whether to formalize the partnership that would grant them joint authority to expose corporate manipulation, while making all of them permanent targets for elimination. Colonel, my military training taught me that the most important security work involves protecting people from threats they can't identify or counter on their own. And your assessment of our current threat situation? Our current threat involves corporate interests using systematic sabotage and assassination to prevent diplomatic facilities from succeeding, while ensuring that defensive capabilities remain unavailable to counter attacks that serve profit margins rather than either species' actual security needs. Mick accessed the formal bonding protocols that would make his partnership with the twins permanent. That seems like exactly the kind of systematic threat that requires coordinated defensive response from people whose personal bonds guarantee they'll prioritize protection over corporate convenience. As they prepared to formalize the bond warden partnership that would grant them joint authority to counter the corporate conspiracy, while making all of them permanent targets for elimination by interests that profited from vulnerable diplomatic facilities, Mick realized that his simple frontier security assignment had evolved into protecting the future of peaceful coexistence from forces that viewed diplomatic success as an existential threat to profitable warfare. The corporate assault on remote station Alpha 7 commenced during the formal bond warden ceremony, as infiltrated personnel activated sabotage systems, while external operatives launched coordinated attacks designed to eliminate the defensive capabilities and create evidence that extremist factions were responsible for destroying their own diplomatic facilities. The ceremony itself took place in the hidden vault, with Mick and the twins using their combined authority to activate ancient defensive networks while exposing the corporate agents who had been systematically undermining frontier security. Corporate infiltrators are activating throughout the station, Mick reported through the bond connection, as compromised personnel began sabotaging life support systems, communication networks, and security protocols to create vulnerabilities for the external assault. The attack is coordinated to eliminate defensive capabilities, while creating evidence that Valkyrie extremists destroyed their own peace negotiation facility. The defensive systems are detecting unauthorized explosive devices throughout the station, Lyra confirmed, her consciousness merging with his to coordinate countermeasures while accessing threat assessment networks that revealed the scope of corporate conspiracy. But the hidden defenses can protect against the sabotage if we complete the bond warden activation. The ceremony proceeded with corporate agents already moving through the facility, their attacks designed to exploit the security vulnerabilities that systematic infiltration had been creating over months of preparation. Mick and the twins conducted the formal bonding while simultaneously coordinating the exposure of corporate conspiracy to frontier command networks that had been operating under corrupted intelligence about the source of attacks on diplomatic facilities. "I'm Michael Harrison," he said, as bioneural scanners confirmed his permanent integration with Valkyrie defensive systems. "Accept the bond warden responsibility with the understanding that protective technology serves both species' security rather than the corporate interests that profit from artificial conflicts." "And we, Lyra and Myra Velthane," they replied in unison, their consciousness now permanently linked to his through bonding protocols that created unprecedented cooperation between human strategic thinking and Valkyrie defensive technology. "Confirm the partnership and commit to defensive cooperation that protects diplomatic efforts rather than the corporate war profiteering that has been systematically eliminating peace negotiation facilities." The ceremony's completion activated comprehensive defensive networks that not only protected the station from the immediate assault, but also exposed corporate infiltrators throughout the frontier zone, while broadcasting evidence of the systematic sabotage that had been preventing successful diplomatic cooperation between species. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of corporate conspiracy designed to eliminate defensive capabilities, while maintaining profitable conflicts through systematic attacks on diplomatic facilities that were blamed on extremist factions rather than corporate manipulation. The evidence led to mass arrests of corporate agents, the dissolution of war profiteering networks, and the establishment of new defensive protocols that protected peace negotiations from corporate sabotage. 6 months later, Mick found himself working as the chief of Frontier Defense Coordination aboard the joint Human-Valkyrie Command vessel Guardian, where his military expertise and bond warden authority ensured that defensive systems protected diplomatic efforts rather than serving corporate interests that preferred frontier zones to remain in profitable conflict. The defensive networks are operating flawlessly across all frontier territories, he reported to Lyra and Myra, who now coordinated ancient Valkyrie technology while maintaining their partnership with human strategic capabilities. No corporate infiltration, no systematic sabotage, and definitely no false flag attacks designed to eliminate diplomatic facilities. "The peace negotiations are succeeding beyond projections," Lyra confirmed, her bioluminescent markings glowing with colors that Mick's enhanced awareness recognized as deep satisfaction mixed with contentment. Frontier settlements are establishing permanent cooperation, rather than the temporary truces that corporate interests had been systematically undermining. The evening routine they developed involved reviewing defensive protocols while sharing the kind of family conversation that had become natural through months of bonded partnership. Mick could access the twins' understanding of ancient technology, while they could benefit from his strategic analysis of threats that required both technological and psychological countermeasures. Any regrets about accidentally becoming guardian to alien children with access to defensive technology that spans star systems? Only, Myra said with the smile that had become his favorite aspect of their shared consciousness, that it took Papa's elimination by corporate agents for us to find someone whose protection philosophy includes enough personal investment to resist the profitable conflicts that war profiteers try to maintain through systematic elimination of defensive capabilities. The best guardianship, Mick replied, is always the kind that protects people from threats they can't counter alone, especially when those threats involve systematic manipulation by interests that prefer vulnerability over effective protection. As they settled into the shared defensive planning that had become their evening routine, a practice that combined advanced technology with family bonds that ensured defensive capabilities served protection rather than exploitation, Mick reflected on the journey from routine security assignment to partnership with remarkable children, whose trust had made him responsible for defensive networks that protected diplomatic cooperation throughout the frontier zone. You know, he said, feeling their shared consciousness settling into the peaceful synchronization that marked successful integration of human strategic thinking with Velkari defensive philosophy. When I arrived at Alpha 7, I expected standard security duties at a frontier diplomatic facility. And now I realize I was being evaluated for the most important security responsibility in the frontier zone, protecting not just individual facilities, but the entire concept of diplomatic cooperation from corporate interests that prefer profitable conflicts to successful peace negotiations. Mick paused, accessing their shared understanding of how completely their professional and family relationships had integrated. It's either the most successful accidental adoption in military history, or the most elaborate way anyone's ever discovered they were meant to protect something larger than individual missions or personal advancement. Why not both? Lyra replied, her consciousness touching his with the partnership that had become the foundation of their collaboration. Though we prefer to think of it as the most successful defensive partnership ever activated, one where the guardian and the protected discovered that the most important security comes from people who choose to care about each other's welfare rather than the profitable vulnerabilities that corporate interests try to maintain between potential allies. The best defensive systems, Mick agreed, are always the ones that protect relationships rather than just territory or resources. Michael Harrison had started as someone who provided security for individual facilities during routine frontier assignments. He'd ended up as someone who provided security for the concept of peaceful cooperation itself, protecting diplomatic relationships from corporate interests that preferred civilization to remain in artificial conflict for profitable exploitation, one accidentally accepted guardianship at a time. And somehow, in the process, he discovered that the most important military service of his career hadn't been tactical. It had been the construction of family bonds strong enough to operate advanced defensive technology that required personal investment rather than professional distance, especially when that technology was designed to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their defenselessness for profit. The twins had taught him that true security wasn't about controlling territory or eliminating threats. It was about building relationships strong enough to make exploitation impossible and cooperation inevitable. Every evening as they reviewed defensive protocols together, Mick was reminded that the most sophisticated weapons systems in the galaxy were useless without the trust an emotional investment that made someone willing to use them for protection rather than conquest. Papa always said, Lyra mentioned during one of their planning sessions, that the defensive systems work best when they're operated by people who understand that the goal isn't to defeat enemies, but to make it impossible for anyone to benefit from creating enemies in the first place. Corporate interests profit from fear and separation, Myra added with the wisdom that came from having lived through their parents' elimination by those same interests. But when people choose to protect each other, there's no profit in manufacturing conflicts between them. As Mick looked out at the frontier settlements that now thrived under the protection of defensive networks, operated through bonds of genuine care, rather than military protocol, he realized that his 2 young charges had transformed him from a soldier who followed orders into a guardian, who understood that the most important battles were fought not with weapons, but with the decision to choose cooperation over the profitable conflicts that others tried to maintain through manipulation and fear. The Bond-Warden partnership had given him more than access to advanced technology. It had given him a family worth protecting, and a purpose worth the risks that came with standing against those who preferred civilizations to remain vulnerable to exploitation rather than strong enough to choose peace.